demonic possession. The Cursed Woman's Unending. This terrifying tale begins in a small, desolate neighborhood, shrouded in shadows and filled with eerie tension. An old woman, frail and seemingly burdened by life, rummages for scraps in a heap of discarded garbage under the fading sunlight. Her world changes when she finds a red coat, and with it, a mysterious black cat that seems unnaturally fixated on her. This is just the beginning of her descent into a night of supernatural horror. Harassed by the cat and later by drunken talks, the old woman's presence appears to summon something dark and vengeful. The cat reappears throughout the night, and when the thugs intent on robbery find themselves face to face with the old woman, now a towering, ghastly apparition, their terror becomes palpable. No one, human or spirit, is left untouched by the malevolence that she embodies, and by the time the story ends, lives have been shattered and curses unleashed that will haunt anyone daring to recall this encounter. Part 1. Margaret's Descent into Darkness. The last rays of sunlight clung desperately to the horizon, casting the alley in hues of blood red and deepening purple. Margaret moved slowly, her frail body burdened by exhaustion. Each step sent a jolt of pain through her thin, aching legs. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and the cold bit at her fingertips, even through the thin, worn gloves she wore. This alley was her prison, and yet it was also the closest thing to a home she had known for years. She paused by the crumbling brick wall, leaning heavily on her cane. The weight of her years pressed down on her with merciless force. Margaret's eyes, dulled and rimmed with weariness, scanned the litter-strewn ground. The garbage pile in front of her reeked of decay, its scent a cruel reminder of her desperation. She steeled herself, closing her mind to the stench, and knelt down, her bones creaking with protest. Her gnarled hands, chapped and raw, began sifting through the refuse. She pushed aside scraps of molding paper, shards of broken glass, and the skeletal remains of rats. The coldness of the ground seeped into her knees, but Margaret ignored it. There was no room for discomfort or dignity. Hunger was a tyrant that left no space for such luxuries. Her fingers closed around something hard. Hope flickered in her chest, fragile and fleeting. She pulled it free, a stale, half-eaten crust of bread, encrusted with grime. Margaret's stomach twisted, a mix of hunger and revulsion. She clutched the bread to her chest, her breath catching in her throat. To anyone else it would have been trash. To her it was salvation. With trembling hands she brushed away what filth she could. The bread was stiff, but she forced herself to take a bite. The taste of dirt and decay filled her mouth, but she chewed and swallowed, tears slipping down her hollow cheeks. She could not afford to be choosy. Life had stripped her of everything but the will to survive. The wind picked up, slicing through the narrow alley like a knife. It howled, carrying with it the scent of rain, and something else, something metallic and cold. Margaret shivered, pulling her tattered shawl closer. The shadows around her seemed to shift and stretch, taking on shapes that defied logic. She dismissed it as the tricks of an aging mind, the product of fatigue and hunger. But deep down, a sliver of fear wormed its way into her heart. She took another bite of the bread, but her appetite had soured. The wind's mournful wail grew louder, drowning out the sounds of the city beyond. Margaret's pulse quickened. There was something wrong, something deeply unnatural about this night. She glanced around, her gaze darting from one shadow to the next. For a moment she thought she saw movement, a flicker of darkness deeper than the night itself. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to be anywhere but here. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind." But the wind did not whisper. It did not carry with it the guttural, hissing voices that now seemed to echo in her ears. Margaret's hands tightened around her cane. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled. Panic clawed at her chest. She felt watched, hunted. The realization struck her with cold, brutal clarity she was not alone. The shadows thickened, swallowing what little light remained. Margaret's breath came in ragged gasps. She forced herself to rise, leaning heavily on her cane. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat echoing like a death knell. She needed to leave this place now. Step by painful step she moved forward. The alley twisted and turned, a maze of stone and darkness. The whispers grew louder, their words incomprehensible but laden with malice. Margaret's vision blurred, and she stumbled, catching herself against the wall. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, as if the darkness itself had come alive and wrapped around her. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice a mix of fear and defiance. The only answer was the wind, now a chorus of mocking laughter. Margaret's hands shook. She pressed onward, driven by a primal need to survive. But the shadows followed, pressing closer, suffocating her with their presence. She turned a corner, her eyes wide with terror. At the far end of the alley, a figure stood. It was little more than a silhouette, a shape cloaked in darkness. Margaret's heart stopped. The figure did not move, but its attention was fixed on her. She could feel it, a cold, penetrating gaze that stripped her bare. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to obey. She was trapped, a fly caught in a web spun from nightmares. The figure took a step forward. The shadows around it writhed and pulsed, as if alive. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She backed away, her body trembling. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring her fear. It reached out a hand, skeletal and blackened, its fingers tipped with claws that glinted in the dim light. "No," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. She stumbled backward, her cane slipping from her grasp. She fell hard, the impact jarring her bones. Pain shot through her, but she barely registered it. The figure loomed closer, the shadows coiling around it like a shroud. Margaret could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that froze her blood. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices that tore at her mind. Margaret pressed her hands to her ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. She was drowning in darkness, suffocated by fear. The figure knelt before her, its hand mere inches from her face. Margaret's vision swam. She was powerless, a broken old woman with nothing left to give. But then a noise cut through the chaos, a dog's bark, sharp and urgent. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The shadows quivered, and for a brief moment the oppressive weight lifted. Margaret gasped, sucking in air as if she had been drowning. She blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the empty alley behind. The wind died, and the whispers faded into silence. Margaret lay there, trembling and gasping. She had been spared, but for how long? Whatever had found her in the darkness was not gone, it was merely waiting. Watching. She pushed herself to her knees, every movement agony. She grabbed her cane and forced herself to stand. There was no time to rest. She needed to leave this place before the darkness returned. The alley stretched out before her, long and winding. The shadows still lingered, but they seemed less oppressive now, as if waiting for another chance. Margaret took a step, then another, her cane tapping against the stones. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her heart pounded in her chest. She was alive, but she knew the darkness had not let go. It never would. Margaret staggered forward, her mind racing. She had faced hunger, cold, and despair, but this was something far worse. This was a darkness that could not be fought with strength or willpower. It was a force that would haunt her every step, a reminder of how fragile life truly was. The wind picked up again, and Margaret quickened her pace. She had survived, but the night was far from over. Part 2. The Red Coat. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness that hung over the alley like a suffocating blanket. Margaret's breaths came in ragged gasps, her thin chest rising and falling as she leaned against the cold, rough wall. The encounter with the shadows had left her shaken to her core, every nerve in her body taut with fear. She pressed a hand to her heart, willing it to slow. She had survived, but the feeling of being watched had not faded. It lingered, a cold weight pressing down on her shoulders. She needed to move, to escape this place before the darkness returned. Pushing herself off the wall, Margaret forced her legs to carry her forward. Her cane tapped against the cobblestones, each step a reminder of her frailty. But then something caught her eye, a flash of color in the sea of grime and decay. Red. It stood out starkly against the drab gray of the Alia coat, draped carelessly over a broken fence. The fabric was vibrant, almost glowing in the dim light, and it seemed strangely untouched by the filth around it. Margaret's eyes widened. A coat. A real coat. The chill that had settled into her bones flared painfully, reminding her of how bitterly cold she was. Her threadbare shawl offered little protection from the night air. The temptation was immediate and visceral. Margaret took a hesitant step forward, then another. She reached out, her fingers brushing the fabric. It was soft, softer than anything she had touched in years. She hesitated. It didn't make sense. How could a coat like this have ended up here, in this forgotten alley? It was too fine, too perfect. But the cold gnawed at her, and practicality won out over suspicion. She needed warmth, and here it was. With trembling hands, Margaret lifted the coat from the fence. It was heavier than she expected, the weight of it both comforting and strange. She shook it out, bits of dust and debris falling away, and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, wrapping around her like an embrace. She closed her eyes, savoring the feeling. For a moment, the fear, the hunger, the darkness, all of it faded. When she opened her eyes, she caught her reflection in a shard of broken glass on the ground. The red coat fit her perfectly, as if it had been made for her. The fabric hugged her thin frame, the collar resting gently against her neck. It should have been loose, hanging awkwardly from her frail shoulders, but it wasn't. It fit too well. Margaret's brow furrowed. She ran her hands over the fabric, feeling the strange heat that radiated from it. Something about the coat was ... wrong. She couldn't explain it, but unease coiled in her stomach. The alley seemed darker now, the shadows pressing closer. She glanced around, half expecting to see the figure from before. There was nothing, only silence. With trembling hands, Margaret lifted the coat from the fence. It was heavier than she expected, the weight of it both comforting and strange. She shook it out, bits of dust and debris falling away, and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, wrapping around her like an embrace. She closed her eyes, savoring the feeling. For a moment, the fear, the hunger, the darkness, all of it faded. When she opened her eyes, she caught her reflection in a shard of broken glass on the ground. The red coat fit her perfectly, as if it had been made for her. The fabric hugged her thin frame, the collar resting gently against her neck. It should have been loose, hanging awkwardly from her frail shoulders, but it wasn't. It fit too well. Margaret's brow furrowed. She ran her hands over the fabric, feeling the strange heat that radiated from it. Something about the coat was ... wrong. She couldn't explain it, but unease coiled in her stomach. The alley seemed darker now, the shadows pressing closer. She glanced around, half expecting to see the figure from before. There was nothing, only silence. "Just a coat," she whispered, trying to convince herself. But the words felt hollow. Margaret took a deep breath and adjusted the collar. The warmth was too comforting to discard, no matter how unsettling it felt. She needed it. She would not freeze for the sake of a feeling. She took a step forward, and the coat moved with her, its fabric flowing like liquid. Margaret's fingers brushed against something in the pocket. She stopped, her breath catching. Carefully she reached inside and pulled out a small, tarnished locket. It was delicate, the kind of thing that might have been treasured by someone long ago. She opened it with trembling hands. But the interior was empty, no picture, no inscription, just a hollow space that seemed to mock her. Margaret shivered despite the warmth of the coat. She slipped the locket back into the pocket and continued walking. The night seemed darker now, the air heavy with something she couldn't name. Each step felt heavier, as if the cold were pulling her down. But she couldn't take it off. She didn't want to take it off. The warmth was too inviting, too necessary. The wind picked up again, but it was different this time. It carried with it a low, mournful sound of whisper that wrapped around her like the tendrils of a cold mist. Margaret stopped, her grip tightening on her cane. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. She turned, her eyes darting to every shadow. The cold pressed against her skin, as if tightening its hold. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The only response was the wind and the whispers that seemed to echo within her own mind. Margaret's hands trembled. She felt trapped, as if the alley were closing in on her. The cold's warmth turned stifling, the fabric pressing against her chest like a vice. She stumbled forward, her vision blurring. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. They filled her head, drowning out her thoughts. The cold pulsed, each beat matching the frantic rhythm of her heart. Margaret gasped, her knees buckling. She fell to the ground, the cobblestones cold against her hands. "Let go," she whispered, though she didn't know who she was speaking to. The cold's warmth became a searing heat, burning through her skin. Margaret clawed at the fabric, but it wouldn't budge. It clung to her, alive and hungry. The whispers reached a crescendo, a symphony of malice that threatened to tear her apart. Margaret's vision went dark. She was drowning in red, the cold consuming her. Images flashed before her eyes, a woman's face, twisted in agony, a child's laughter that turned to screams, a river of blood flowing through an empty street. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The cold tightened, squeezing the air from her lungs. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure eased. The whispers faded, leaving only a ringing in her ears. Margaret lay on the ground, gasping for breath. The cold's warmth had returned to something almost comforting, but she knew better now. It was no ordinary garment. It had chosen her, and it would not let go. Slowly, painfully, Margaret pushed herself to her feet. The alley was silent once more, but the darkness felt different, alive, aware. She clutched her cane, her knuckles white. The red coat hugged her body, its weight a reminder of what she now carried. She took a step forward, then another. The night stretched out before her, long and full of shadows. And somewhere, deep within the fabric of the coat, something stirred. Margaret walked on, the warmth of the red coat, a cruel comfort against the chill of the night. Whatever fate awaited her, she knew one thing for certain: the coat had marked the beginning of a path she could not turn back from. It had chosen her, and it would not let her go until it had finished what it had begun. Part 3. The Black Cat's Stare. The wind howled through the narrow alley, a mournful wail that seemed to whisper secrets only the darkness could understand. Margaret pulled the red coat tighter around her frail frame, its warmth the only comfort she had known in what felt like an eternity. But even that warmth now felt suspect, as if the coat itself harbored a silent malevolence. Each step she took felt heavy, her legs laden with exhaustion and dread. She needed to get away from this place, from the shadows that seemed to stretch and ride just beyond her vision. She turned the corner, her cane tapping nervously against the slick cobblestones. The city around her was a forgotten ruin, its cracked walls and broken windows echoing with the ghosts of the past. Margaret's breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air biting at her lungs. She paused for a moment, leaning heavily on her cane, trying to gather what little strength she had left. That's when she saw it. At first it was just a shape, a patch of darkness within the darkness, but as her eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer: a black cat, sitting perfectly still in the middle of the alley. Its fur was like liquid midnight, absorbing the faint light around it, and its eyes Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The cat's eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, twin orbs of amber that seemed to pierce straight into her soul. Margaret's first instinct was to look away, to break the cat's gaze. But she couldn't. It was as if those eyes held her in place, rooting her to the spot. The world around her fell away, leaving only the cat and its unblinking stare. Time stretched and twisted, seconds feeling like hours. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears. She tried to tell herself it was just an animal, just a stray. But deep down she knew better. There was nothing ordinary about this creature. The cat blinked slowly, its movements deliberate, almost mocking. Margaret's hands tightened around her cane until her knuckles turned white. "Shoo," she whispered, her voice trembling. The cat did not move. It simply stared, its gaze unwavering. A chill ran down her spine, colder than the night air. She took a hesitant step forward and raised her cane, waving it in the cat's direction. "Go on, get out of here," she said, louder this time, the desperation evident in her voice. The cat's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Margaret thought it might finally turn and slink away. But instead it stood up, its movements fluid and almost too graceful. It took a single step toward her, and then another. Margaret stumbled backward, her heart pounding. The shadows around her seemed to close in, as if drawn to the cat's presence. "Stay back," she warned, her voice cracking. She swung her cane in a wide arc, hoping to scare it off. The cat didn't even flinch. It continued its slow, deliberate advance, its eyes never leaving hers. Margaret's hand shook. She could feel the cold sweat on her forehead, the rapid beat of her pulse. This was no ordinary cat. It moved with a purpose, a cold intelligence that sent a wave of nausea through her. As the cat drew closer, the air around Margaret grew heavy, oppressive. She felt as if she were being suffocated, as if the darkness itself were pressing down on her. She tried to take a step back, but her legs refused to cooperate. Panic surged through her veins. The cat stopped just a few feet away, its gaze burning into her. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying her, as if weighing her soul. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. "What do you want?" she whispered, the words barely audible. The cat's tail flicked once, a slow, deliberate motion. It was the only response she received. For a moment silence reigned. The world held its breath, waiting. Then, without warning, the cat opened its mouth. A low, guttural sound emerged, a growl that should not have been possible from such a creature. It reverberated through the alley, a dark vibration that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her feet. Margaret buckled, and she fell to the cold stone, her cane clattering away. The cat stepped closer, its movements predatory, its eyes alight with a malevolent gleam. "No, no, please," Margaret pleaded, crawling backward. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, the darkness pressing against her skin. The red coat that had once been her refuge now felt like a trap, tightening around her with every breath she took. The cat's growl deepened, and for a brief, horrifying moment, its eyes seemed to change, flickering with an otherworldly light that defied explanation. Margaret's back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to go. The cat was inches away now, its breath warm against her face. She could see every detail: the sleek, unblemished fur, the glistening fangs hidden behind its lips, the eyes that held both ancient wisdom and unspeakable cruelty. The cat leaned in closer, its gaze unrelenting. Margaret felt as if she were being pulled into those eyes, drowning in their depths. In a final act of desperation, she reached for her cane. Her fingers closed around it, and with a strength born of pure terror, she swung it at the cat. The cane passed through empty air. The cat was gone. Margaret blinked, her chest heaving. She looked around, her eyes wild. The alley was empty, the shadows still and silent. But the dread did not leave her. She could still feel the cat's gaze lingering like a ghostly touch. It was watching her somewhere, somehow. Margaret pushed herself to her feet, her body trembling. She clutched the cane to her chest, using it to steady herself. The red coat pressed against her skin, its warmth now suffocating. She took a step forward, then another. The alley stretched out before her, long and full of darkness. The cat was gone, but its presence remained a reminder of the darkness that had taken notice of her. Margaret knew she was not safe. The shadows had claimed her, and they would not let her go. She walked on, her eyes darting to every flicker of movement, every shifting shadow. The night was far from over, and the darkness was just beginning to reveal its true nature. As she moved deeper into the labyrinth of alleys, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears, a purr, low and sinister. Margaret quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness was alive, and it was watching her. It would always be watching. Part 4. Rejection at the Iron Gate. Margaret's legs were trembling, each step heavier than the last. The red coat clung to her like a second skin, its warmth both a comfort and a curse. The encounter with the black cat had left her rattled, the memory of its burning eyes and low, guttural growl replaying in her mind. She felt its presence still, like a shadow that refused to let go. The narrow alley seemed to close in around her, suffocating and oppressive. Finally, Margaret stumbled into an open courtyard. The cobblestones gave way to dirt and dead grass, and at the far end stood a house, a tall, imposing structure surrounded by a wrought iron gate. The house was old, its paint peeling and windows darkened, but to Margaret it was a haven. She leaned against the gate, gasping for breath. The cold metal pressed into her back, but she didn't care. She needed to rest, if only for a moment. The night was relentless, and she was so tired, so very tired. Margaret slid down to the ground, her back against the iron bars. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind rustling the dead leaves. For a brief moment she allowed herself to feel safe. The gate felt sturdy, unyielding, a barrier between her and whatever nightmares the darkness still held. She clutched her cane and the hem of her red coat, her fingers trembling. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was only seconds. Margaret couldn't tell. The exhaustion muddled her senses. She barely registered the sound of footsteps approaching, their rhythm brisk and impatient. A sudden, harsh voice shattered the fragile peace. "What are you doing here?" The words were sharp, each one like a slap. Margaret's eyes snapped open. A woman stood on the other side of the gate, her silhouette framed by the dim light from the house. She was tall and dela, her posture rigid with disdain. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes, cold and piercing, narrowed as they took in the sight of Margaret. Margaret struggled to her feet, clutching the bars of the gate for support. I'm just resting," she said, her voice thin and wavering. "I'll be gone soon." The woman stepped closer, her expression hardening. "Resting?" Here she laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "Do you think this is a charity, you old hag? Feels like you doesn't belong here." Margaret flinched, the words cutting deeper than any blade. She had heard insults before, too many to count, but each one still left a scar. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, but the woman cut her off with a wave of her hand. "I won't have it. I won't have beggars and vagrants sullying my doorstep. Get out of here." The woman's voice rose, sharp and commanding. Now Margaret took a step back, her grip tightening on the bars. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I'll leave." But the woman wasn't satisfied. She leaned in, her face twisted with contempt. "People like you are a blight on this city. You think anyone cares about your sob stories? You think you're entitled to kindness just because you're old?" She spat on the ground, the gesture filled with disgust. Pathetic tears welled in Margaret's eyes. She wanted to shout back, to defend herself, but no words came. She had no strength left for anger or pride. She turned away, her shoulders hunched, and began to walk. Her feet dragged across the dirt, each step a struggle. Behind her, the woman's voice rang out one last time. "And don't come back. If I see you here again, I'll have you thrown in the gutter where you belong." Margaret didn't look back. The gate creaked as it closed, the sound echoing in her ears, like the finality of a door slamming shut. She felt the weight of rejection pressing down on her, suffocating and cold. The night stretched out before her, vast and unwelcoming. She clutched her cane tightly, using it to steady herself. The red coat swirled around her ankles as she moved, its warmth now a bitter reminder of how little she had to protect her from the world's cruelty. The wind picked up, biting at her exposed skin. Margaret shivered, drawing the coat closer. The alleyway seemed darker now, more sinister. Every shadow was a threat, every whisper a reminder of her isolation. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The woman's words echoed in her mind, cruel and unforgiving. Pathetic Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to cry out against the unfairness of it all. But the night offered no comfort, only indifference. She stumbled over a loose stone, catching herself just in time. Her body ached, and her heart felt like it might shatter. The world had cast her aside, and there was nothing left but the darkness. She found herself wandering aimlessly, the weight of despair pulling her down. The red coat felt heavier with each step, its warmth a cruel mockery of the cold that seeped into her soul. Margaret clutched it tightly, as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. The memory of the black cat's eyes haunted her the way it had stared at her, unblinking, as if it saw something no one else could. Something broken, something doomed. The wind howled, and Margaret pressed on. She didn't know where she was going, there was nowhere left to go. The streets were empty, silent save for the sound of her own footsteps. The shadows shifted around her, watching, waiting. She could feel their eyes, their malice. The rejection at the iron gate had left her raw and vulnerable, a wound that refused to heal. As she turned another corner, Margaret caught sight of a small alcove nestled between two crumbling buildings. It was little more than a narrow gap, but it offered shelter from the wind. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, collapsing against the cold stone. The red coat pulled around her, its fabric stained and frayed. She hugged her knees to her chest, trembling. The memories came then, flashes of a life that once held hope and warmth. The laughter of a child, the touch of a hand, the sound of a fire crackling in the hearth. They felt like a dream, something distant and unattainable. Margaret closed her eyes, willing the memories to fade. They offered no comfort, only pain. She sat in the darkness, the wind howling outside. The red coat, once a symbol of fleeting hope, now felt like a shroud. Margaret's fingers traced the fabric, her touch light and trembling. The warmth was still there, but it was hollow and illusion that could not protect her from the cold reality of her life. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the night, though she didn't know who she was speaking to. Perhaps to the woman at the gate, perhaps to herself. The words were swallowed by the wind, lost and forgotten. Margaret's eyes fluttered closed. She was so tired. The night stretched on, vast and empty. The darkness pressed in, but she no longer had the strength to fight it. She clutched the red coat tightly, a fragile shield against the world's cruelty. And as sleep claimed her, she knew that the darkness was not done with her. It never would be. Part 5. Blood and the Taste of Fear. The wind had finally died down, leaving a deathly silence in its wake. Margaret, shivering and weak, found refuge beneath a gnarled, leafless tree in a forgotten corner of the city. Its skeletal branches reached skyward, like the twisted fingers of some ancient monster clawing at the night. She collapsed onto the cold ground, pulling the red coat tightly around her frail body. The warmth it offered was faint, but enough to stave off the biting chill that seeped into her bones. Her hand shook as she pulled the remnants of her meager meal from a pocket of the coat, a stale crust of bread, hardened and unyielding. She stared at it for a moment, her hollow eyes reflecting despair and exhaustion. There was no pleasure in eating anymore, only the desperate need to quiet the gnawing hunger that had become her constant companion. With a heavy sigh, she lifted the bread to her mouth and took a bite, her jaw aching as she forced herself to chew. The taste was bitter, coated with the grime of the streets. Margaret grimaced, fighting the urge to spit it out. She was too hungry to waste even a morsel. But as she bit down again, a sharp, searing pain shot through her mouth. She gasped, the bread falling from her trembling hands. Warmth filled her mouth, thick and metallic. Panic surged through her veins, and she spat onto the ground, desperate to rid herself of the sensation. The dark liquid pooled in the dirt, glistening under the pale light of the moon. Blood. Margaret stared at it, her chest heaving. Her tongue probed the inside of her mouth, and she felt the jagged, empty space where a tooth had once been. With shaking hands, she touched her lips and found them stained crimson. Another wave of pain struck, and she doubled over, clutching her jaw. Something hard and foreign rested against her tongue. She spat again, and a blackened tooth fell to the ground, landing with a sickening thud. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. The sight of the tooth, a twisted, decayed remnant of herself, filled her with dread. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. It felt cold, lifeless, as if it had never belonged to her at all. Margaret's breath quickened, each inhale ragged and shallow. She felt as though the world were closing in, the shadows pressing against her with a suffocating weight. She dropped the tooth, her hands flying to her mouth, as if to hold in what little remained of her. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. The taste of blood lingered, metallic and cruel. She tried to wipe it away, but the more she scrubbed, the more it seemed to stain her skin. The tree's branches creaked overhead, and for a moment she thought she heard laughter, low and mocking, carried on the wind. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She pressed her back against the tree, willing the world to right itself. But when she opened her eyes, she saw it again. The black cat. It stood a few paces away, its form barely visible against the darkness. But its eyes, those eyes burned with an intensity that made Margaret's blood run cold. They glowed like twin embers, unblinking and merciless. The cat's gaze was fixed on her, its body motionless. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the cat took a step forward. Margaret's chest tightened. She pressed herself harder against the tree, as if hoping it might swallow whole. "No," she murmured, shaking her head. "Go away." Her voice was a pitiful whisper, lost to the night. The cat didn't respond. It took another step, its movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring her fear. "Leave me alone," she cried, her voice cracking. She grabbed a stone from the ground and hurled it with all her strength. It struck the dirt near the cat, sending up a small cloud of dust. The cat didn't flinch. It didn't even blink. It simply continued its advance, its eyes never wavering. Margaret's hands fell limp at her sides. She felt the fight drain out of her, replaced by a cold, creeping terror. The cat stopped just a few feet away. Its eyes seemed to bore into her, seeing everything: her fear, her pain, her hopelessness. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of how alive she was and how close she was to losing that life. The air around her grew heavy, thick with an oppressive weight. She could barely breathe. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The cat tilted its head, as if considering her words. Then, slowly, it opened its mouth. The sound that emerged was not a meow or a growl, but something far more sinister, a low, guttural noise that resonated deep within her chest. It was a sound that spoke of ancient things, of darkness and despair. Margaret clutched her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She felt as though she were drowning. The cat's eyes burned brighter, and for a moment Margaret saw something within them, images fleeting and terrible. She saw herself, younger and full of life, standing in a sunlit meadow. She saw the faces of loved ones long gone, their smiles twisted into screams. She saw fire and blood, shadows and death. The visions came in a torrent, overwhelming her senses. She clutched her head, trying to shut it all out, but it was useless. The images burned into her mind, leaving her trembling and broken. The cat stepped closer, its eyes never leaving hers. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. She felt as if she was standing on the edge of a precipice, one step away from falling into an abyss, from which there was no return. The taste of blood was still on her tongue, a cruel reminder of her fragility. She wanted to run, to escape, but her body refused to move. She was trapped, a prisoner of her own fear. The cat's tail flicked once, a slow, deliberate motion. It was a gesture of finality, of inevitability. Margaret's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground. The cold earth pressed against her palms, grounding her in a reality that felt like a nightmare. She closed her eyes, praying for it to end. But the darkness around her only grew deeper, the weight of it crushing. When she opened her eyes again, the cat was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that pressed against her ears. Margaret's body shook, the adrenaline leaving her weak and spent. She stared at the spot where the cat had been, half expecting it to reappear. But there was nothing, only darkness and the faint rustle of leaves. Margaret wiped the tears from her face, her fingers stained with blood. The taste still lingered, a cruel reminder of her mortality. She clutched her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart. She was alive, but for how long? The shadows around her seemed to whisper, their voices low and mocking. The nightmare was far from over. It had only just begun. She pushed herself to her feet, every muscle protesting. The red coat felt heavier now, its warmth suffocating. She took a step forward, then another, her movement slow and deliberate. The taste of blood was still there, bitter and unforgiving. Margaret knew that the darkness was watching, waiting. She was not safe, not now, not ever. As she walked into the night, the wind picked up once more, carrying with it the faint sound of a cat's purr. Margaret quickened her pace, her heart pounding. The darkness had claimed her, and it would not let go. Part 6. Pursuit Through Darkness. The chill of the night bit into Margaret's skin as she staggered through the labyrinthine streets. The shadows seemed to deepen with every step, stretching long fingers across cracked cobblestones and peeling walls. She clutched the red coat tighter around her frail body, feeling its warmth but unable to shake the cold sweat that trickled down her back. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her heart pounded like a drumbeat of dread. Behind her, the soft pad of paws echoed in the silence, steady and unhurried. The black cat was still there, following her, its presence as oppressive as the darkness itself. Margaret didn't dare to look back. She could feel its eyes on her, burning through the night with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It was no ordinary creature, she knew that now. It had marked her, and it would not relent. "Please, leave me alone," she whispered to the night, her voice trembling. But the darkness offered no response, only the whisper of the wind through empty streets. Margaret quickened her pace, her worn shoes scraping against the uneven ground. She stumbled, nearly falling, but caught herself against the rough surface of a wall. Her hands were trembling, and her knees felt weak. She couldn't keep running, but stopping wasn't an option, either, not with that thing behind her. The alleys twisted and turned, a maze that seemed to have no end. Margaret's sense of direction faltered, and panic clawed at her chest. She turned a corner, her breath catching in her throat. For a brief, fleeting moment, she thought she had lost it. The silence was absolute, pressing down on her like a weight. She leaned against the wall, her heart hammering. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was over. But then she heard it, the soft, deliberate sound of paws against stone. Closer this time. Margaret's stomach twisted. The cat was toying with her, drawing out her fear. She pushed herself away from the wall and stumbled forward, her vision blurred with tears. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going. Every step was agony, every breath a struggle. As she emerged onto a wider street, Margaret's relief was short-lived. Two figures loomed ahead, their silhouettes blurred by the flickering light of a nearby lamp. They moved with the unsteady gait of drunken men, their laughter coarse and grating. Margaret's heart sank. She wanted to turn back, to disappear into the shadows, but it was too late. They had seen her. "Well, what do we have here?" one of the men called out, his words slurred. He was tall and thin, his clothes disheveled and stained. He staggered toward her, a predatory smile spreading across his face. His companion, shorter and stockier, let out a low chuckle. Lost, are we? The second man sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Out here all alone? Margaret's grip on her cane tightened. She took a step back, her body trembling. I don't want any trouble, she said, her voice thin and pleading. The tall man exchanged a glance with his friend, and they both laughed a harsh, mocking sound. No trouble at all, he said, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. We're just having a bit of fun. They closed in, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators circling their prey. Margaret's breath quickened. She could feel the darkness pressing in around her, the weight of the cat's unseen gaze. It was still there somewhere, watching. She was trapped, caught between the men's leering grins and the oppressive presence that had haunted her steps. Leave me be, she whispered, taking another step back. The men ignored her. The shorter one lunged, his hand reaching for her arm. Margaret did on instinct. She swung her cane with all the strength she could muster. It connected with his shoulder, and he let out a yelp of pain, stumbling back. The old hag, he snarled, his face twisted with rage. He lunged again, and this time the tall man moved to block her escape. Margaret's heart pounded. She was out of options, out of time. The darkness around her seemed to pulse, alive with malice. She could feel it pressing closer, suffocating her. Suddenly a low, guttural growl cut through the air, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Margaret's neck stand on end. The men paused, their eyes darting around nervously. The growl deepened, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The taller man sneered, trying to mask his fear. What was that? The shadows shifted, and the black cat stepped into the dim light. Its eyes glowed with a cold, unearthly light, and its fur seemed to ripple as if it were made of liquid darkness. It moved with a predatory grace, each step deliberate and silent. The men stared, their bravado faltering. Just a cat, the shorter man muttered, though his voice wavered. Nothing to be afraid of. But the cat's gaze was fixed on Margaret, and she could feel its power, an ancient, malevolent force that wrapped around her like a shroud. The air grew colder, and the men took an involuntary step back. The tall man's eyes narrowed, and he forced a laugh. Stupid animal, he spat. Get out of here, he kicked at the cat, but it moved faster than he could react. One moment it was on the ground, the next it was on him, its claws sinking into his flesh. He screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound that echoed through the street. Blood sprayed, dark and glistening in the pale light. The shorter man stumbled back, his face pale with terror. What is this? He gasped, his eyes wide. The cat's growl deepened, and it turned its gaze on him. Margaret watched, paralyzed, as the darkness seemed to thicken around the creature, swallowing the light. The shorter man backed away, his hands raised in a futile gesture of surrender. No, he whimpered. Stay away. The cat leapt, its movements a blur. The man's scream was cut short, replaced by the sickening sound of flesh tearing. Margaret closed her eyes, her body shaking. She wanted to run, to escape the horrors unfolding before her, but her legs refused to move. The air was thick with the scent of blood, and the cat's growl reverberated through her bones. When she finally dared to open her eyes, the street was silent once more. The men lay motionless on the ground, their bodies broken and lifeless. The black cat stood over them, its eyes glowing with a cold, cruel light. It turned its gaze on Margaret, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. There was no pity in those eyes, no mercy, only darkness. The cat took a step toward her, and Margaret stumbled back, her body trembling. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't. The cat paused, its head tilted as if it were listening. Then, slowly, it stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from sight. The oppressive weight lifted, but the cold remained. Margaret stood there, her body numb, the taste of fear still bitter on her tongue. She looked down at the bodies of the men, their faces frozen in terror. The darkness had claimed them, just as it had claimed her. Margaret turned and fled, her steps unsteady. The red coat billowed around her, its warmth a cruel reminder of how close she had come to death. The streets were empty, the shadows watching. She could feel their eyes, their hunger. The darkness was not done with her, not yet. She ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The night stretched on, long and unyielding. The black cat's eyes haunted her every step, a reminder that there was no escape. The darkness had chosen her, and it would follow her to the ends of the earth. Margaret didn't stop. She couldn't. The shadows whispered her name, and she knew that the nightmare was far from over. It had only just begun. Part 7. Transformation and Terror. The night clung to Margaret like a shroud, cold and suffocating. The alley was a prison of shadows, and the air tasted of decay. She pressed herself against the damp wall, every muscle in her frail body trembling. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her heart pounded in her chest. The two men leered at her, their eyes glinting with malicious amusement. They had cornered her, cut off any hope of escape. Margaret could see it in their expressions, the predatory hunger, the thrill of dominance. To them she was nothing, a broken, helpless woman. Pray. The tall man stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate, savoring her fear. You think you can just walk away from us, he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Not so fast. Margaret's hand shook as she gripped her cane. She tried to steady herself, tried to find words that might appease them, but her voice failed. The shorter man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed through the alley. Look at her, he said, his words slurred by drink. She's scared out of her mind. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. She was trapped, cornered like an animal. The weight of her helplessness pressed down on her, crushing her spirit. She closed her eyes, desperate for the nightmare to end. But when she opened them, something inside her shifted. A searing heat flared in her chest, burning away the fear, the weakness. It was as if the red coat she wore had ignited a fire within her, a fire that refused to be extinguished. The taller man reached for her, his hand rough and callous. Come on, don't make this harder than it needs to be, he said, his breath reeking of alcohol. Margaret's grip on her cane tightened. She felt the heat intensify, coursing through her veins like molten iron. Her skin prickled, and a low guttural growl escaped her lips, an inhuman sound that reverberated through the alley. The men hesitated, their eyes widening. The growl grew louder, deeper, and Margaret's body convulsed. Pain tore through her, white-hot and relentless. She doubled over, clutching her stomach. What the hell, the shorter man muttered, taking a step back. Is she? Margaret's bones cracked and twisted beneath her skin. Her spine arched, her joints contorting in ways that defied nature. She let out a scream raw, primal, and filled with agony. Her fingernails lengthened, curling into jagged claws. The red coat fused with her body, its fabric pulsing as if it were alive. It clung to her, reshaping itself, melding with her flesh. Her face elongated, her jaw distending to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Her eyes blazed with an unnatural light, burning crimson in the darkness. The men stumbled back, their bravado crumbling into terror. What is she? The taller man whispered, his voice trembling. The answer was clear. She was no longer human. She was something else, something monstrous and powerful. And she was angry. Margaret straightened, her movements no longer frail or hesitant. She towered over them, her limbs grotesquely elongated, her body exuding a terrifying strength. The heat inside her had become a storm, raging and uncontrollable. She could feel the darkness coursing through her, feeding off her rage, her pain. It whispered to her, promising power, revenge. She welcomed it. The taller man turned to run, but Margaret moved faster. She lunged, her claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. He fell, blood spraying from the deep gashes in his back. He tried to crawl away, his hands scrabbling at the slick cobblestones, but Margaret was upon him. She grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground with ease. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, he saw the truth. He had awoken something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Please, he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret's grip tightened. The red coat pulsed, feeding off his fear. She could hear the beat of his heart, smell the stench of his terror. For a brief moment, the human part of her, the part that remembered pain and helplessness, wanted to let go. But the darkness within her demanded otherwise. It hungered. With a snarl, she flung him aside, his body crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground, motionless. The shorter man screamed, his face pale and glistening with sweat. He turned to flee, but Margaret was already moving. Her movements were fluid, almost graceful, as if the transformation had stripped away every ounce of frailty. She blocked his path, her burning eyes locking onto his. "No," he whimpered, falling to his knees. "Please, I didn't mean." Margaret tilted her head, the motion eerily slow. Her lips curled back, revealing her jagged teeth. She could feel his fear, taste it in the air. The darkness surged, urging her to end him, to tear him apart. She raised her clawed hand, poised to strike. But then, something inside her faltered. A memory, a fleeting image of herself, broken and helpless, cornered by cruelty. She saw the fear in the man's eyes, and for a moment, she saw herself reflected back. Margaret's hand trembled. The heat inside her wavered, the storm threatening to consume her. The darkness whispered, its voice seductive and cold. "Do it," it hissed. "They deserve it." She hesitated. The man crawled backward, his eyes never leaving hers. You're a monster," he stammered. The words cut deep, piercing through the fog of rage. Margaret's vision blurred, and the heat began to subside. She stepped back, her body convulsing as the transformation began to reverse. Her bones cracked and shifted, her claws retracting. The red coat loosened its grip, falling back into place around her shoulders. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The darkness retreated, but it left its mark deep and indelible. The shorter man scrambled to his feet and fled, his screams echoing through the night. Margaret lay there, her body trembling, the weight of what she had become pressing down on her. The alley was silent once more, save for the faint rustle of the wind. She could still feel the darkness within her, lurking just beneath the surface. It was a part of her now, and it would not be denied. Tears streamed down her face as she curled into herself, clutching the red coat. She had become a monster, a creature of rage and darkness. The men's terror, their pain, haunted her. But so did the taste of power, the intoxicating rush of strength. The darkness had awakened something within her, something that could not be easily forgotten. Margaret stared into the shadows, her burning eyes dimming but not extinguished. The night was long and the darkness was patient. It would come for her again, and next time she might not have the strength to resist. Part 8. The cat's malevolent presence. The air was heavy with the stench of blood and fear, the silence fractured only by the shallow, panicked breaths of the man still alive. Margaret stood over him, her body trembling as the last vestiges of her monstrous transformation receded. Her jagged claws retracted into gnarled fingers, her blazing eyes dim, but the memory of their crimson glow lingered like embers in the darkness. She looked down at her hands, stained red and shaking uncontrollably. Horror and nausea clawed at her insides. The man who had mocked her only moments before now lay crumpled against the alley wall, his eyes wide with terror. Blood matted his hair and pooled beneath him, staining the cobblestones. He whimpered, trying to push himself away from her, but his strength was gone. Margaret took a shaky step back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. What had she become? The power that had surged through her veins, the fury that had overtaken her, it was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. She could still feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for another chance to consume her. Then she felt it, a presence, a cold, watchful gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. Margaret turned slowly, her heart pounding. There, perched atop a crumbling wall, was the black cat. Its fur glistened like liquid shadow, and its eyes, those piercing, amber eyes, glowed with an otherworldly light. It did not move, did not blink. It simply watched, as if it had been there all along, silently bearing witness to the carnage. Margaret's knees buckled, and she stumbled backward. She whispered, her voice raw and broken. The cat tilted its head, a gesture that might have seemed curious on any other creature. But there was nothing innocent about this one. Its eyes were too knowing, too calculating. Margaret could feel it, an intelligence that went far beyond that of a mere animal. It had been there when she transformed. It had seen everything, and now it was judging her. The man on the ground let out a strangled sob, drawing Margaret's attention back to him. His face was pale, his body trembling. He stared at the cat with wide, unblinking eyes. What is that?" he gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. He clutched at his chest, as if trying to shield himself from an unseen force. Margaret followed his gaze, her mind racing. The cat's presence was more than unnerving, it was oppressive, as if it carried the weight of centuries of darkness. The cat leapt down from the wall with a fluid grace that defied reason. It landed silently, its eyes never leaving Margaret. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the light and deepening the shadows. Margaret's heart pounded. She wanted to run, to escape the suffocating presence of the creature that had haunted her every step. But she couldn't move. The cat's gaze held her in place, like a marionette on invisible strings. The man on the ground tried to crawl away, his breath coming in desperate gasps. The cat's ears flicked, as if acknowledging him for the first time. It took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. Margaret could feel its power, a cold, malevolent force that seeped into her bones. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg it to stop, but no words came. The cat's eyes blazed brighter, and Margaret felt the darkness within her stir in response. "No," she whispered, clutching her chest. She could feel it, the pull, the temptation to give in, to let the darkness consume her once more. The red coat tightened around her, its fabric pulsing as if alive. Margaret's body trembled. The cat's presence was amplifying it, feeding the darkness that lurked within her. It was a catalyst, a spark that threatened to ignite the fire she had tried so hard to extinguish. The man's screams cut through the night as the cat stepped closer. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The cat's eyes held her captive, forcing her to watch. The man's pleas for mercy echoed off the walls, mingling with the pounding of her heart. The cat stopped inches from him, its gaze cold and unfeeling. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then the cat turned its head, its eyes locking with Margaret's. She felt a surge of heat, a wave of energy that threatened to consume her. Images flashed before her eyes, visions of fire and blood, of shadows that writhed and twisted. She saw herself, transformed and monstrous, tearing through the streets. She saw the cat, always watching, always guiding. Margaret gasped, the visions overwhelming her. The darkness within her roared to life, and she fell to her knees, clutching her head. "Stop it," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please, stop." The cat blinked, and the vision ceased. Margaret's body sagged with exhaustion. She could feel the darkness receding, but it was still there, lurking at the edges of her mind. The cat stepped back, its eyes never leaving hers. It seemed to be waiting, as if testing her, judging whether she would succumb or resist. The man's breathing had slowed. His eyes were glassy, his body motionless. Margaret forced herself to stand, her legs weak and unsteady. She took a step toward the cat, her voice trembling. "Why?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. "Why are you doing this?" The cat tilted its head again, its expression unreadable. It took a step back, then another, before disappearing into the shadows. Margaret stood alone in the alley, the silence oppressive. She could still feel its presence, lingering just beyond the edge of the light. It was not gone, it would never be gone. It was a part of her now, a dark spectre that would follow her every step. Margaret collapsed against the wall, her body trembling. The red coat pulsed, its warmth suffocating. She could still feel the darkness within her, the power that had transformed her into something monstrous. But The cat's presence had awakened it, and now she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the lifeless man before her. She had wanted to survive, to escape the cruelty of the world. But at what cost? The darkness had given her power, but it had taken so much more. Margaret closed her eyes, the weight of the night pressing down on her. She could still feel the cat's gaze, watching, waiting. It had unleashed something within her, something she couldn't control. The wind howled through the alley, carrying with it the faint echo of a cat's purr. Margaret shivered, her body cold despite the warmth of the coat. She was no longer the woman she once was. The darkness had claimed her, and the cat had ensured it would never let her go. She stood, her body weak, but her resolve hardened. If this was to be her fate, she would not go quietly. The cat's malevolent presence had awakened something within her, but she would fight it, even if it meant battling the darkness every step of the way. The night was long, and the shadows were deep, but Margaret would not surrender. With a final glance at the place where the cat had disappeared, she turned and walked into the darkness, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. The battle was far from over, and the darkness was patient. It would come for her again, and when it did, she would be ready. Part 9. Whispers of the Cursed. Dawn crept over the horizon, its pale light brushing against the edges of the desolate streets. The darkness of the night receded slowly, as if reluctant to give up its hold. The silence was thick and oppressive, broken only by the distant cry of a lone crow perched atop a crumbling rooftop. The wind, cold and biting, swept through the empty alleys, carrying with it whispers, fragments of fear and disbelief, stories that had already begun to take shape in the hearts of those who had watched from the shadows. Margaret walked with slow, deliberate steps. Her feet dragged across the uneven cobblestones, and each movement felt like a struggle against the weight of an unseen burden. The red coat clung to her like a second skin, its warmth now more suffocating than comforting. The events of the night replayed in her mind images of blood, terror, and the burning gaze of the black cat. She could still feel it, lurking just beyond the edge of her awareness, a malevolent force that had entwined itself with her very soul. The townspeople began to emerge from their homes, drawn by a mix of morbid curiosity and the pull of something they could not name. They kept their distance, their eyes wide with fear and suspicion. Whispers spread like wildfire, growing and twisting with each retelling. Did you hear? They murmured to one another, their voices low and tremulous. The old woman in the red coat. She cursed Margaret felt their stares, their fear pressing down on her like a heavy shroud. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall of a dilapidated building. Her hands were trembling, her body cold despite the warmth of the coat. She wanted to speak, to tell them that she was still human, that she hadn't chosen this fate. But the words caught in her throat. What would they say? What could they possibly believe? She had become something more than human and far less. "Stay back," someone hissed from the crowd, their tone laced with both fear and revulsion. Margaret lifted her head, her eyes meeting theirs. She saw the way they recoiled, the way they whispered among themselves. To them, she was no longer just an old woman. She was a monster, a creature born of darkness and blood. A living legend. "Did you see her eyes?" a young boy whispered, clutching his mother's hand. They glowed, like fire. The mother pulled him close, her gaze never leaving Margaret. "Hush," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't speak of it." She'll hear. Margaret turned away, her heart aching. She couldn't blame them. She had seen the terror in the men's eyes, felt the darkness coursing through her veins. She had become something to fear. The red coat felt heavier, as if it were weighing her down, binding her to a fate she could never escape. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with stories of curses and vengeance, of darkness that could not be vanquished. "She killed them," someone muttered, their voice trembling with a mix of awe and horror. The men who crossed her tore them apart. Margaret's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground. The cobblestones were cold against her palms, and for a moment she wanted to sink into them, to let the earth swallow her whole. The memories of the night's violence played over and over in her mind. She had wanted to survive to escape the cruelty of the world, but the darkness within her had taken that desire and twisted it into something monstrous. A shadow fell over her, and Margaret looked up. The black cat sat atop a stone pillar, its eyes blazing with a cold, malevolent light. It watched her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The whispers around her grew hushed, as if the townspeople too could feel the weight of its gaze. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The cat had been there from the beginning, its presence entwined with every step she had taken. It was more than a mere observer, it was the architect of her curse. Why, she whispered, her voice raw with pain and despair. Why me? The cat's eyes narrowed, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Margaret thought she saw something pity, perhaps, or a hint of understanding. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. The cat turned away, disappearing into the shadows as if it had never been there. Margaret felt its absence like a weight lifted from her chest, but the darkness it had left behind remained. The townspeople began to retreat, their whispers fading into the distance. Margaret was left alone, surrounded by the ruins of her life. She pushed herself to her feet, her body trembling. The red coat clung to her, its fabric stained and torn. It was a reminder of what she had become, a vessel for the darkness, a symbol of a curse that would never be lifted. She began to walk, each step heavy with the weight of her fate. The wind howled around her, carrying with it the echoes of the townspeople's whispers. The old woman in the red coat, they said, beware her gaze, beware her curse. Margaret's heart ached, but she kept moving. She would not stop, not now. She had no choice but to live with what she had become. The darkness was a part of her now, a shadow that would follow her wherever she went. But she would not give in to it, not completely. She would fight, even if it meant battling the darkness within her every day for the rest of her life. The whispers would spread, becoming stories, then legends. They would paint her as a monster, a vengeful spirit clad in red. Children would be warned to stay away from dark alleys, to never cross paths with the cursed woman. But they would never know the truth, the pain, the struggle, the humanity that still lingered beneath the curse. Margaret walked on, her steps echoing through the empty streets. By the time the sun rose fully, the whispers had taken on a life of their own. They wove tales of vengeance and terror, of an old woman transformed by a darkness she could not escape. They spoke of a red coat that burned like fire, and a black cat that watched from the shadows. And in every tale, Margaret's fate became a warning, a reminder that darkness, once unleashed, could never truly be banished. Margaret stopped at the edge of town, the wind tugging at her hair. She looked back, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and defiance. The darkness within her stirred, but she pushed it down. She would not be its puppet. She would not be its monster. As she stepped into the forest beyond, the whispers followed her, carried by the wind. They would spread far and wide, becoming a legend that would outlive her. But Margaret would keep walking. She would fight, and she would never let the darkness win.